Hey, this is Derek Murphy. Today we're going to have a really low-tech video about what to do when your book gets too long. So this is a question I come across pretty often on Reddit or Facebook. Someone's finished their first epic fantasy, but it's 300,000 words or whatever. And the common advice is to split it down into different chunks, but not everybody talks about how to actually do that. So I wanted to show you what that process might look like with my own work in progress right now. And I also made some quick notes here about what to do about length, how to fix your story, how to self-edit and make sure you have the strongest possible version of your novel. So we're going to jump into all of that stuff in this video. So I do have some other videos about my writing and editing process. I have a 4-step editing process, but I've been working on this book for the last couple of months and I've got a week left to finish it. I'm in that anxiety depression phase, and a lot of this video will sort of be therapy because I find that talking through my unfinished manuscript sometimes gives me back the motivation or some insights that I really need to move forward. But I'm also going to give you some juicy, valuable stuff that I probably said better in other videos. So I do recommend, any one of these things I could talk about for an hour. So wrapping it all up really quickly just to hit the main points could be even more beneficial because I'll only be talking about the most important stuff, but also won't be as satisfying if you really need to get the nitty gritty and understanding of how to write more dramatic and engaging fiction. I've probably got other videos for you. So here's the quick notes I made for this video. If your book is too long, it's probably a POV problem or a backstory problem. This is something that comes up really often in first-time books where they don't really know who is telling the story. Is it first person or third person omniscient? Am I inside other characters' heads or not? Often, a lot of people try to juggle too many point of view characters at the same time. So there's no main character. There's just a whole bunch of different stories trying to come together. Sometimes they get too into the head of the main antagonist, or they're like develop the antagonist side of things while they're developing the main character. To put it really simply, a novel is an introspective of an impossible event told from the standpoint of the one character who has the awareness and the personal relevancy to find meaning in the particular telling of this story. This is how a character got from the person who was not able to handle the challenge to the person who becomes able to handle the challenge. Even if you're not writing character-driven fiction, that tends to be true for the vast majority of novels, especially commercial fiction. So you may want to keep in mind if you have a problem with POV jumping, if you're jumping between a lot of different characters, then your book probably will be too big because you're not telling one story. You're trying to tell many stories at the same time. And if this is your first major novel, it's not a good idea to try to do the hardest thing. Of course, some people have managed it. Of course, you can point to examples of famous authors who have written a book that way, but it's not the easiest way to write a novel. And I don't recommend that you start doing it that way. So you may have to make some decisions. And if your book is already written, it may be too late for you unless you figure out who is actually the main protagonist of this particular story and which scenes are relevant. To get him to the place where he needs to have the insight that he or she needed to have through the telling of this story. So anyway, that's one thing to keep in mind. And the other big one is backstory. So I've added some little bullet points here about backstory. Backstory is really one of the most egregious things that new authors get wrong because they feel like it's important to explain everything. And I have other videos about scene checklists. There are certain things you need to have in every scene to make sure that it's engaging and that your main story is going somewhere. But none of that stuff works with backstory for a specific reason, and that is because it's concluded action. So generally, you probably want to stick with a chronological time point where things develop and then things are in a sequence like dominoes, the next piece of the puzzle, the next thing, the characters are always, they have some short-term goal. There's a response or a reaction, generally failure for the first, 2 or 3/4 of the book. For most of the book, your characters are taking action and failing or being rebuffed until they fully understand the scope of what they're up against and they fully recognize what it's going to cost them. And what it's going to cost them is always more than they are willing to lose. The character or the protagonist at the beginning wants one thing that they will not give up because it will destroy their personal view of who they are and what they represent. So it's a death of self. When you get to that point, they have to give up the thing that they wanted. They have to sacrifice everything, whether that's their love or their life or whatever, and make the choice to give that thing up for the greater good or for to be heroic or whatever. That's generally how most dramatic commercial fiction plays out. The problem with all backstory is that it's already happened. So there is no suspense, intrigue, or drama because it's not the main story. It's just background information that helps readers understand the context. And it is important because you have to prove to readers that this major challenging event towards the end of the book is big enough and difficult enough that it's impossible for this particular character. So maybe it's not impossible for other characters, but the reason the protagonist is a protagonist is because the main challenge at the end of the book is specifically impossible for their own sense of core identity. So that's why, even though backstory is really important, it has to come at the right time. If you have multiple point of views and you have different characters, the backstory of that particular character always comes right before that particular character's necessary action. Probably, I've got some blog post somewhere that breaks down some big Netflix series or movies. And the way it generally works is that, maybe there's a team of four people and each of them has an essential task and each of their essential tasks has a specific challenge that is only impossible for them. And at that moment, when each character is about to do their challenge, we might get that backstory. If it's just a single character, then the backstory is generally in the middle of the final battle scene towards the end of the book when they recognize that the villain has them pinned, that they cannot triumph easily, they can't triumph without giving up their core self, and then they reach back into their memory. There's always this like turning point where time slows down, everything freezes. They might have a flashback or a memory then where they finally fully unveil exactly why this challenge is so difficult for them by recognizing or reliving that ancient trauma. And then they finally make progress. But a backstory is generally a short, dramatic scene that gives context to the current challenge. That assumes you have a current situation. Whenever you've got a story that evolves over centuries, or you're trying to tell like one story 100 years ago and then another story a decade later, or whatever. This is also pretty common with prologues or prefaces. You don't want that background information to become a 20 chapter story or whatever. You want the story that you're telling to be the story. You want one core story, generally with one core protagonist. That's not absolutely necessary, and I know that a lot of new authors, they don't want to do that. They want to talk about redeeming the or sympathizing the villain or having the hero turn out to be the villain or multiple POV jumps. A lot of new authors tend to try to do the hardest thing. And even if you succeed with finishing a book, it may not be a very good book because you haven't practiced the core elements of responsible storytelling, which means telling a story that engages readers until they actually want to continue reading to the end. You're making it much harder for yourself by putting in more information that is relevant to the engaging part of the story that readers are actually there for. You can, to some extent, fix backstory. Maybe if you're telling, the characters need to know what happened a long, long time ago, you can fix it by adding a discovery into the scene, which means rather than, info dumping. And info dumping is when the narrator is just talking to readers directly and nothing is happening on the stage. An easy way to remember show, don't tell is just, what does this look like right now? What would this look like on my television screen? If you have to pause the characters so that they are not doing anything and time is passing while you, the narrator, are just talking to readers, that's never a very good sign. There are some genres and some books where that kind of breaking the fourth wall narration works, but generally it does not for a variety of reasons. And it's something that you can look out for and remove or fix by, instead of just telling readers, find a way for your characters to discover the information. You want to give the information when it is the most impactful and dramatic, which means when your main characters can have an emotional reaction to that information. Also, each piece of information is a plot twist. Every new discovery they make is one shocking thing that happens. That's an event that ends the scene or the chapter because that's the turning point. They discover the thing that happened, then you can move on to the emotional reactions or whatever. Another thing that new authors tend to do is they'll just info dump tons and tons of stuff, and then the characters are like, "Wow, cool! I didn't know that," or whatever. You need to have them react to the stuff that's happening. You can't just tell it to readers. There is some extent of like foreshadowing or forewarning, but generally, if you tell readers what's going to happen and then your characters do those things and they discover it for themselves, it all feels flat because readers already saw it and then the characters didn't see it yet and then the characters figure it out finally. We don't really care about their emotional reaction because we're way ahead of them on the story. Okay, so that's probably enough for now. Just to give you a quick background on what to do if your book is too long. It's probably POV or backstory. Those are things that you can fix, and you will probably need to edit out or streamline in your novel. Um, I'm personally facing a different issue. I've written over 20 novels. I'm working on book 5 of a fantasy series and deciding where I had to split this book, which is tricky. And this is the reason. I tend to plot pretty well. I've got a 25 chapter plot outline that works for me. It works for a lot of other people. You can find that on creativeindie.com. And the problem with the book I'm writing is that I have tried to map out my story into these 25 plot points. And basically, I know where the story is going. However, this book is due in a week. It's still super, super rough. One of the reasons I like making videos like this is because I don't have a very polished process, and I think it's beneficial for writers to see the total mess that my manuscript is in its current state, even though I'm planning to publish it in a week, which is terrifying. And I might not make my deadline. We'll see how it goes. But I do have a lot of this written. I tend to make notes about like what happens in the chapter, and then when I clean it up and I've done some more polishing, my chapter's almost clean, I'll go back and just leave the chapter number so I know that I've gotten through to that point. And what I had figured out a week or two ago was that I wasn't going to make this deadline because my book was way too long, but also that it didn't need to be so long. So I do have books that are over 100,000 words. I've got one that's 150,000 words, and my series tend to get longer. So the first one might be shorter, and the later books in the series might be longer, which is also fine. Harry Potter, I think the last book is like triple or more of what the first book was. However, partly it's a timing issue, and partly I looked back at the word counts of this particular series, and these books tend to be shorter. So this current manuscript is at 100,000 words, but the first book I think was like 56,000 words. Most of the other 4 books in the series I don't think are longer than 65,000 words. So even though I could, finish this and dump it, um, I'm only at 100,000 words now, and I'm not even halfway finished. So this could easily be a 200,000 word book. I don't think it'll be quite that long, but um, it makes sense for me to break this book up. That's problematic because, like I mentioned, I've got a 25 chapter plot outline. I already kind of have a lot of this story, so it's hard to just break it randomly. There is sort of a critical twist that happens around the midpoint, and that's what I was trying to get to. But that's way down, like here, where one of my main side characters dies. Spoiler alert, but I'm assuming that you don't read my fantasy young adult novels, which you shouldn't because you're probably not the right audience for them anyway. So that was my plan to break it there, but even that was too long, and because I only have a week left, I'm just not feasibly going to get there. So I went way back and I have what I think is a plausible ending point for this particular book. And that's sort of where I've blocked things off. So all I've done in the last week or so is try to organize the ending of what has to be this fifth book, and then break this into two pieces, basically, where that the last half of this, which I haven't even written yet, but I have most of it mapped out, is going to be the actual final book of this series. So I can show you what I'm working on now. I've basically split it and reorganize the chapters a little bit without doing too much work on the content. You can see already this is a lot cleaner just because I've cut out half of it, which is a lot of rough notes. And now I'm about halfway done. Although a lot of this is written, I'm really struggling with the last two chapters where I have a whole bunch of notes and scenes, and I'm having trouble meshing them all together, which is a particular challenge I have myself because I'm not really a discovery writer. Pantsers, I think, have it a little bit easier where they just keep writing and then all of the content kind of holds up. I do a lot of research and a lot of outlining, and then I write some scenes and I have to force it to all fit together, which is tricky. But I do feel like I'm getting pretty close. I basically have two chapters that I have to finish editing. Then I have time for a final proofread. I won't quite get through my 4 rounds of editing that I usually do. However, this is pretty clean already. And the difference right now is I'm basically thinking in terms of the ending. And it's tricky because, like I mentioned, I don't have now the format that I had before with the 25 chapters, well balanced, motivational um, drive to keep readers engaged and to make sure there's these turning points that tighten the drama and the emotion and everything. I don't have all of that. So what happens is I've got basically the first half of a novel without all of the climactic parts, which is tricky because this is like book 5 of a urban fantasy. So there should be more fight scenes or dramatic action scenes, and there's very little of that. I'm not too worried because I feel like this is the world worth saving part where I'm showing all of the touching scenes between my characters before shit's going to hit the fan in the final book and things are actually going to matter more. So I tend to be maybe a little bit more of a slower writer in terms of my stories might be a little deeper than some other people's stories, which is not necessarily a good or a bad thing. And it's not necessarily something I'm doing on purpose. It's just that the story I want to tell ends up being so big that I have to split it in half. And then the first, like this whole book is mostly going to be set up and it's going to be good enough that people will read it and enjoy it, but it won't be, action scenes and battle scenes, which I'm also basically okay with as long as I hit it really well, as long as I hit all those emotional scenes really well, and as long as readers if it's interesting enough for readers to keep reading, then it's fine. And there are a lot of cool like world building stuff in this half of the book. But I'm thinking about how to end this. So going back up here, where to split your book, there's basically two paths. You either end it with a really hard cliffhanger, which I've done for the previous books in this series, um, which I am perfectly okay with. I think it's okay to end a book on a cliffhanger. Readers don't really like them. They may say stuff like, this is not a finished book because there's no epilogue. It's not all resolved. You didn't answer any of the questions. I'm not too concerned with that. As long as readers want to keep reading the story, I think that's a position of strength. Of course, if you are a slow writer and you don't get the next book out for a very long time, which is true in my case, readers have a right to be disappointed that they can't continue right away. So cliffhangers are a little bit, readers don't like them, but they're not ineffective in terms of keeping reader engagement. But you also might want to end with some soft, rosy stuff. So I had the same issue previously with my vampire dystopia, where I had, the last book was twice as long as it needed to be. I had to split it in the middle. So I basically had to pick a random mid spot to end it. And I picked a nice rosy scene, which was kind of like a wedding. So there was some action, there was some stuff. I ended it with like a happy, everyone's together wedding scene because it was nice and pretty and it kind of felt like a conclusion or an ending. And then, the action picks up again in a big way in the last book. I'm figuring out still exactly how that's going to work out here. Like I mentioned, I'm struggling with these chapters. That's why when I'm struggling with a chapter, I'll make like a little outline at the beginning um, in bullet points of what happens, and I'll rearrange those things, and then I'll keep, adding to those sections. And then once I've got that section done, I'll delete the header. But right now it's still a complete mess, but it's only like one or two chapters. I basically know what happens in the next chapter. And then I have, whoops, this is the other book. So this is the one I'm working on. Sorry, that was pretty messy. It's still pretty messy, but um, I've got here end of the book. I've got some notes. I've got some stuff that I don't know where I'm going to fit yet. And then I have a possible last chapter. There's two things I don't really know exactly how they're going to fit it in. I do want some romance with the main love interest in this book, and I haven't found a place to put it in yet. I think it belongs kind of at the last, so there's a little bit of a soft, rosy ending. Also, like for things to really matter later, obviously I'm going to try to kill all of my characters. So if you want to make their deaths dramatic, or even the possibility of their deaths dramatic, you have to tighten the emotional romance and friendship and everything first. That's what most of this book is doing, is just bringing everybody together with a lot of nice um, relatable, emotional scenes, building the friendships, building the relationships, a little bit of backstory on a lot of my major characters, because in the last book, some of them are going to die, and I want that to hit as hard as possible. So it makes sense to close this out with a little bit of, the new status quo is my protagonist being in a happy relationship, because that's going to be taken away from her very early in the next book. So it makes sense to have it here. But there's also a pretty hard cliffhanger moment where she has this vision of the future and everybody dies, and now she knows what's going to happen and she has to stop it. So I don't know exactly which one of those things is going to be the end of this installment of this series. I haven't quite got there yet. Probably I'll have both. I'm not sure which one I will have at the end. So anyway, I wanted to make this video. Hopefully it talked about a lot of things. I have talked a lot more about each of these things in longer, better videos on my YouTube channel. So I hope that you will watch. I haven't published anything on YouTube for a long time because I've been working on this book, like I mentioned, for the last couple months. And now I have to finish this book and then finish the last book in this series, and maybe another one or two books this summer is my goal. But if you're also writing this summer and you like to learn about the craft of writing, and you value this kind of behind the scenes dump about my messy writing process, I encourage you to stick around. I do have a lot more polished resources and some books and courses and things that you can also find if you look around for them. Good luck writing. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.